I wanted to work on a mint hot cocoa macaron so I could have something that was very winter forward without being attached to any holidays or even specific colors. So for me, the whole macaron is going to be very hot cocoa focused, and because of that I'm starting off with a brown macaron shell. I really love to use the French method for small batches in my kitchen, and as you saw there, I'm using a combination of two different browns. I don't know, this is just a personal preference. You do not have to do that. I just really liked using a little bit of the gel and the powder. The two different colors kind of balance each other in my mind. And then I'm just going straight on with my French method, getting my room temperature egg whites whipping there, adding in my regular granulated sugar when it's looking white and frothy. And then when it's about 70% of the way whipped, I'm adding in both the gel and the powdered food colorants. If you want to use any other kind of technique, the Italian method, the Swiss method, etc., you absolutely can do that. Don't let me stop you. Do what works best for you in your kitchen. Here with that French method, I'm really looking for a nice stiff peak. That is going to give me the structure I need as I incorporate in the dry ingredients and then continue with that macaronage process. The dry ingredients, of course, are the almond flour and powdered sugar. In my home kitchen, I really just like to give these both a really good sift together. You can use a food processor and you can risk it and do nothing, but just be careful if you are not food processing and or using a sifter. You may end up with a few lumps that have nothing to do with your technique and everything to do with both almond flour and powdered sugar are ingredients that are very likely to clump up. So if you are experiencing slightly lumpy macarons and you feel like you're doing everything right, that is definitely something I would look into. As you see here, I added in some but not all of the dry ingredients. For me personally, especially with small batches, I usually add in my dry ingredients in about 3 additions. This really helps to make sure I can get everything incorporated without over mixing the batter at this point. I'm not really worried about exactly how I'm mixing, but I also don't want to mix way too much before I even get all of the dry ingredients incorporated in. You want to really be making sure that you're not leaving pockets of ingredients at this point. Besides over mixing, I think that's the thing I would be looking out for the most, just making sure that you are definitely scraping around the sides of your bowl and mixing through to make sure you don't see any white powdery pockets. Yes, you absolutely can do this in your mixer. You can switch over to the paddle attachment to mix in the rest of your ingredients. You can even do the macaronage in your mixer. Personally, especially with small batches, it's something I like to do by hand because I like doing it. It's quite fast, especially because I make so many macarons. I could do this with my eyes closed. So for me, it feels very comfortable to do it this way. But if you want to give it a go in your mixer, definitely give that a try. After I get all of the dry ingredients incorporated, that is when I am going to work on that macaronage, or deflating some of the structure created by whipping the egg whites into that meringue. What I'm going to do for that, there are lots and lots of different techniques for the macaronage, but I really like to scrape my spatula around the sides of my bowl, kind of pressing the batter into the bowl and then folding it over onto itself and pulling the spatula through. That kind of motion will help to carefully and kind of uniformly deflate some of the air in the batter while making sure that I am macaronaging all of the batter and not just the batter right on top. So whether I am doing the mixing process here or the macaronage later, you will see I'm always really careful to continuously scrape my spatula around the sides of the bowl, turning my bowl, adjusting things, scraping the bottom to make sure sure I've got everything together. That is one reason I really like transferring my meringue to a larger, wider bowl, and I really love using glass bowls for this. I know that is not always possible, and especially if you're making larger batches, that gets trickier and trickier. But for a small batch and for people who are just starting out on their macaron journey, I really recommend it. I think it is really, really useful to be able to see everything. As soon as I get this to the ribbon stage, when I pull my spatula up and it flows back down like a ribbon in a nice steady stream back into the bowl, I'm going to transfer my batter into my pastry bag with the piping tip I chose. I generally use an 804, 803 for piping regular sized macarons, though if you want to go larger or smaller, that is absolutely up to you and what works best for you in your kitchen. After I've got all my macaron batter in my pastry bag, I am going to pipe the macaron shells. I generally like working on silpats in my home kitchen, as you see me using here, and because I sometimes like to play around with different shapes and large macarons and small macarons and all different kinds of things, I like to have a lot of silpats that do not already have a template in there. I think it is a lot easier for me to visualize different patterns if I'm not just making regular circles to have to be working over the top of an already inlaid template. But I do have a couple of silpats that do have a template in there, and if you mostly just make regular size macarons, I think those are a really nice tool to have as well. Otherwise, if you just Google search macaron template, you can find dozens of different free versions there, so please do not spend any money buying a macaron template that is basic like this from someone. Do a Google search, print it off, that is all you need. Or if you don't have access to a printer, use a small circle cookie cutter the size of the macarons you want to make, and just use a pen or a Sharpie to create your own template. It is super easy. As soon as I finish piping this entire tray, I'm going to transfer it to the back of a baking pan, give it a little tap to smooth the shells and release any air bubbles. Then I'm going to leave it on my counter for about 20-25 minutes so a skin can form over the top before putting them into the oven. Yes, there are no rest methods, but I really like the resting method in my own kitchen. It just works really well for me. Into the oven they go. Usually I bake one tray at a time at 300 degrees Fahrenheit for about 16 to 18 minutes. Now for the hot cocoa decoration. I have some cocoa powder here, I have some white royal icing in a piping bag, and I have some nice, pretty loose royal icing here, flavored with a little bit of vanilla paste, and then I have some tiny little mini marshmallows, a couple toothpicks, or you could use a scribe, and then I also have a shallow dish. With most of the royal icing, I'm going to just tap in some sifted cocoa powder. This is not hot chocolate mix. This is 100% cocoa powder, and I would recommend not using black cocoa for this because I wanted this to have a really nice light cocoa vibe, and if you use black cocoa, obviously you're going to end up with a very gray or black royal icing, but if that's the vibe you want, please don't let me stop you. I am just going to mix this in completely. I'm adding in the cocoa powder both for flavor and for color. And if you end up adding so much because you're trying to achieve a certain color and flavor and you end up getting a stiffer royal icing again, no worries. Just add in a tiny bit of water or something to thin it out again. So that really is not a concern. You do want this royal icing to be relatively loose because we are going to be dipping the tops of the the macarons in them. And the reason I kept out some of the royal icing white in a regular piping bag is so that I can add on some other decorations. If you've never dipped the top of a macaron shell into royal icing before, it is very easy. You just go straight down, make sure the entire surface is covered, pull it back out, and then give it a little shake just to smooth everything out. When you're thinking about consistency, you want to make sure it's not too thick or a point will kind of poke up there forever. You don't want it to be too thin, otherwise it will run right off the edges. Otherwise, there's kind of a pretty big margin of acceptable consistency there, so I would not stress out too much. If you do dip a couple and it seems like it's too stiff or too loose, you can always scrape it back into your bowl and do something about that. As you see here for this first design, while the royal icing was still wet, I placed some of those mini marshmallows on top, so it really gave it a hot cocoa vibe. With my trials, I did not find that these mini marshmallows got too soggy even while being in the refrigerator or freezer. So if you were worried about that, I don't think that's something I would be worried about, especially if you have your macarons in an airtight sealed container. Another option for decoration, as you can see here at the top of my screen already, is to create more of a latte art or cup of fancy hot cocoa art vibe, and it is so easy to do. Just use a piping bag with some white royal icing and then pipe on a couple or even just one little circles onto the top after you've dipped your macaron shell. Then use a toothpick or a scribe tool to drag through the center of one or both or however many circles you have there to create little hearts. Depending on the placement, you absolutely could do both the heart design and the mini marshmallows. You can create one really large heart in the center. You can get really fancy with your latte art. You can create some other streaks so it looks more like a hot cup of hot cocoa, and there's more of a milky vibe in there. Honestly, there are so many different ways you can play around with this design to really make it look like you've got a nice cup of hot cocoa here. I am just going to keep going creating my designs in royal icing. After I do all of these designs, I've dipped everything. I'm going to leave them on my counter at room temperature to completely harden and dry. So by the time I'm ready to fill them, there is nothing moist, because that could get weird if the very surface is hard, but even if it's a little bit soft inside, it can get a little bit weird once you put it into the refrigerator or freezer. So personally, I like to do this the day before and then fill the following day. Speaking of filling, it is time to get into our mint hot chocolate buttercream filling. Like anytime I'm adding cocoa or chocolate to a buttercream, I like to just load it up. The mint here is coming from a mint hot chocolate mix. I'm going to dump that entire mix in there. If you have another brand of hot cocoa mix, absolutely, that's great. If you don't have a mint cocoa mix, you can add in some mint extract. That is also totally fine. In addition to the mint hot chocolate, I am adding in some regular 100% cocoa unsweetened and some semi-sweet melted chocolate. You can add in dark chocolate, you can add in milk chocolate, that's really up to you. And I'm also adding in quite a bit of salt, because salt and chocolate just pair so well together, and because the cocoa mix does have some sugar and a lot of sweetness in there, I really want to balance that out. I am just mixing this into some leftover vanilla buttercream that I had on hand. Personally, I really prefer using the Italian method or Swiss method for my buttercream. If you are using especially leftover buttercream like I am, that's been sitting at room temperature or in your refrigerator, I really like to use my mini blowtorch that I use for things like creme brulee. And I just use it to heat the sides of my mixer to make sure that everything becomes really nice and homogeneous and smooth. as soon as that's done whipping, I'm immediately going to pipe my macaron shells while that buttercream is just perfect and silky smooth. For this, I'm going in exclusively with that mint hot cocoa buttercream. Honestly, I think it is so delicious on its own, especially with those 3 layers of chocolate in there already, and then also the cocoa royal icing that we have. I honestly don't think this macaron needs anything else. If you wanted to make a chocolate ganache or a mint chocolate ganache to pipe into the center of the buttercream, that could be a whole nother level of delicious. But again, I think even this basic recipe is really, really fantastic on its own. It is so yummy, especially for like a post-holiday winter macaron vibe. I really, really hope you try it out and you enjoy it. If you do give this a try, make sure to tag me over on Instagram so I can see your really hard work. I love seeing all of the things you guys create after watching my videos. Again, thank you so much for being here. If you're not already following me over on Instagram, you can find me at Maddie Brame. Otherwise, make sure to subscribe down below so you don't miss out on any of my other upcoming tutorials and recipes. Until next time, have a wonderful day. Bye!